The Kansas wind of 1876 carried more than just dust across the dry plains. It also carried whispers, sharp as thorns, especially about Sarah. She was a widow, her hands roughened by years of honest work, her eyes holding a quiet sadness since her husband Thomas had passed 2 winters ago. She lived in a small, neat cabin at the edge of town, a place that once felt like a haven, but now seemed to draw every misfortune like a moth to a flame. First, it was the crops. The corn in her small patch withered and died, while her neighbors' fields, just a stone's throw away, thrived. Then, her cow, Bess, a gentle creature that had given good milk for years, suddenly fell ill and was gone within a week. Folks started to talk. They remembered the way her husband had died, a sudden fever that took him quickly, and how the well in her yard had gone dry shortly after. Each small trouble, easy to explain on its own, became a dark thread in a tapestry of fear woven by idle hands and anxious minds. "It's unnatural," old Mrs. Gable mumbled to anyone who would listen, her voice low and full of dread. "First Thomas, then the crops, now Bess. Mark my words, there's a darkness about that woman." Others nodded, their faces grim. They spoke of bad luck, then of curses, their fear growing with each new whisper. Children, hearing their parents' hushed tones, began to point and stare when Sarah walked past. Some even ran away, convinced she carried a hidden evil. Sarah felt the weight of their looks, the chill of their avoidance. She tried to explain the dry spell, the sickness that sometimes took animals, but her words were like feathers against a storm. No one truly listened. Their minds were made up. She was no longer just Sarah, a hard-working widow. To them, she was something else, something dangerous, a bringer of ill fortune. The fear in their eyes was a wall, slowly but surely, cutting her off from the very community she had called home her entire life. She often wondered how a few simple misfortunes could twist into such a terrible accusation, turning her into an outcast in her own town. The whispers had grown into a roar, the fear into a frenzy. One dusty morning, 2 men from the town council, their faces grim and unyielding, arrived at Sarah's cabin. They didn't speak kindly, only telling her she was to come with them. Her heart pounded like a trapped bird as they fastened heavy iron shackles around her wrists and ankles. The cold metal bit into her skin, a physical mark of the terrible accusation. The procession began slowly. Sarah was pushed out onto the main road, the rising sun casting long, mocking shadows. A crowd had gathered, eager and watchful, lining the street as if for a parade. But this was no celebration. This was a spectacle of shame. Her head bowed, Sarah tried to avoid their gazes, but the shouts were impossible to ignore. "Witch!" someone screamed from the crowd, the word like a stone striking her. "Cursed woman!" another cried, their voice laced with hatred. The sound of their voices twisted her insides. She stumbled, the heavy chains dragging, and a sharp pain shot through her ankle. She heard laughter. Children, bolder than their parents, darted forward from the safety of the crowd. Small hands grabbed at bits of dry dirt and pebbles from the road, throwing them with surprising force. A sharp sting on her cheek, another on her shoulder. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, not just from the pain of the stones, but from the deep, crushing hurt of betrayal. These were the children she had watched grow, the ones she had offered a kind word or a piece of candy. Now their faces were distorted by fear and cruelty, mirroring their parents. Every step was a torment. The sun beat down, the dust choked her, and the relentless mocking voices pierced her spirit. Each jeer, each thrown stone, was meant to break her, to make her feel less than human. She saw Mrs. Gable in the crowd, her mouth a tight, judgmental line. Even Mr. Henderson, whose wife Sarah had nursed through a bad fever, turned his back as she passed. The humiliation was a burning fire, consuming her dignity, leaving only ash and despair. She felt utterly alone, a solitary figure against a sea of judgment, being paraded like a captured animal. The town square, usually a place of gathering and commerce, loomed ahead, promising an even greater public torment. The journey to the town square felt endless, each step a further descent into despair. When they finally reached the center, a makeshift platform had been set up, a crude stage for her final humiliation. The crowd, now even larger, pressed in, their faces a blur of angry eyes and open mouths. The men who had brought her pushed her roughly onto the platform. The chains clinked loudly in the sudden tense silence. Sheriff Brody, a burly man with a weathered face, stepped forward. His voice, usually gruff but fair, now boomed with a chilling authority. "Sarah Miller," he announced, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, "you stand accused by this community of bringing ill fortune upon our town. Your presence has brought blight, sickness, and fear." He paused, letting his words hang heavy in the air. "The council has decided. You are a danger to our well-being, a curse upon our homes." Sarah looked out at the faces, searching for any flicker of kindness, any sign of doubt. There was none, only hard stares, judgmental frowns, and a few outright sneers. Her heart, already bruised and battered, sank further. She was truly alone. No one would speak for her. No one believed her. "Therefore," Sheriff Brody continued, his voice echoing, "by the authority vested in me, and with the full agreement of the town council and its people, you are hereby cast out. You will leave our town by sundown today. Should you ever return, you will face harsher judgment." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Cast out, banished. She had nowhere to go, no family left in this world, and no friends who would risk helping her. The thought of wandering alone, branded and broken, filled her with a cold dread. Her knees felt weak. She swayed slightly, the world tilting around her. The shackles felt heavier than ever, not just on her body, but on her very soul. Hope, a fragile thing, snapped inside her. She closed her eyes, wishing for the earth to swallow her whole, wishing for an end to the unbearable shame and the crushing weight of her solitude. It was over. Her life, as she knew it, was utterly destroyed. Sarah stood on the platform, the shame and despair so heavy they threatened to crush her. Her eyes were still closed, praying for a swift end to her misery, when a new sound cut through the ringing silence left by Sheriff Brody's decree. It wasn't a shout or a jeer, but a measured, steady tread. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The crowd, which had seemed so solid and terrifying just moments before, now parted slightly. Through the gap she saw him, Reverend Elijah. He was a quiet man, the preacher of their small, dusty church. His sermons were always gentle, filled with words of kindness and understanding, rather than fire and brimstone. He wasn't a towering figure, but his presence always commanded a quiet respect. His clothes, though simple, were always neat, and his kind, earnest eyes often held a thoughtful look. He rarely raised his voice, and when he did, it was usually to offer comfort or guidance. He had arrived in town a few years back, a stranger, but had quickly earned the trust of most folks, even those who didn't often attend Sunday service. Now he walked with purpose, his gaze fixed not on the angry crowd, nor on Sheriff Brody, but directly on Sarah. There was no fear in his eyes, only a calm resolve that made her heart flutter with a tiny, forgotten spark of hope. The crowd fell utterly silent, watching him with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. No one had expected him to step forward. He wasn't known for grand gestures or public defiance. He reached the platform, his eyes still locked with Sarah's. She could feel the silent questions in the air, the collective wonder of the townsfolk. What would the preacher say? Would he condemn her further, adding his voice to the chorus of judgment? Or would he, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, offer her a glimpse of something different, something merciful? He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, and then, without a word to anyone else, he turned his gaze to the shackles binding Sarah's wrists. Reverend Elijah reached Sarah on the platform. Without a word, he pulled a small, gleaming tool from his coat pocket, a pair of sturdy wire cutters, not something a preacher usually carried. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Brody, standing nearby, looked utterly bewildered. With a determined look, Elijah knelt before Sarah, ignoring the stunned faces of the townsfolk. He carefully positioned the cutters around the iron links binding her wrists. A sharp, metallic snip echoed through the square, surprisingly loud in the thick silence. One shackle fell to the wooden platform with a dull thud, then another snip, and the other wrist was free. He moved to her ankles, repeating the action, and soon all 4 pieces of cold iron lay on the ground, leaving Sarah's skin red and chafed, but gloriously free. Sarah stared at her unbound hands, then at Elijah, her mind struggling to understand. He stood up, placing the cutters back in his pocket, and then, with a gesture that was both tender and firm, he took Sarah's hands in his. Her fingers, still trembling, felt the warmth of his. He turned to face the bewildered crowd. His voice, usually soft, now rang out with a clear, strong tone that cut through the disbelief. "You say this woman is cursed? Woman is... You cast her out without mercy, without proof?" His eyes swept over their shocked faces, meeting each gaze without flinching. "Then hear this truth, declared before God and all of you." He tightened his grip on Sarah's hands, pulling her slightly closer. His gaze softened as he looked at her, a profound tenderness in his eyes that made Sarah's breath catch. Then he turned back to the stunned townsfolk, his voice clear and unwavering. "She is my wife now." The words hung in the air, heavier than any silence. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, a mix of shock, outrage, and utter astonishment. Children stopped fidgeting. Adults stood frozen, mouths agape. Sheriff Brody looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. No one moved, no one spoke. The square was plunged into a stunned, absolute quiet, broken only by the gentle whisper of the Kansas wind. Elijah's declaration was an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of their judgment and defiance. Sarah, still reeling from the sudden freedom, could only stare at the man who had just saved her, offering not just freedom, but a future she never dared to dream of. The words, "She's my wife now," hung in the air, a bell tolling a truth no one in the square could have imagined. For a long moment, the silence was so thick you could almost touch it. The townsfolk were a tableau of disbelief. Mrs. Gable's jaw had dropped, her usual sharp expression replaced by pure shock. Mr. Henderson, who had earlier turned his back, now gaped openly, his eyes wide. Sheriff Brody, still holding his stance near the platform, looked utterly flummoxed, his authority suddenly deflated. Then, a low murmur began to ripple through the crowd, like a disturbed beehive. It wasn't the angry roar from before, but a confused, uncertain buzzing. People started to nudge each other, whispering in hushed tones. "The preacher? His wife? But she's cursed." The words were fragmented, laced with bewilderment. They didn't know how to react. Their careful judgment, their collective fear, had been shattered by one simple, powerful declaration. Elijah, still holding Sarah's hand, remained calm, his gaze steady as he surveyed the stunned faces. He didn't gloat, didn't challenge them further. He simply stood there, a quiet testament to his words. Sarah beside him felt a strange mix of terror and a fragile, blooming hope. The stares were still on her, but now they were different, no longer purely hateful, but filled with questions, with a hesitant uncertainty. Sheriff Brody finally found his voice, though it was weaker than before. "Reverend Elijah, what is the meaning of this?" he stammered, his eyes darting between Elijah and Sarah. "You cannot simply claim a woman who has been condemned." Elijah turned to the sheriff, his expression unyielding. "She is a woman, Sheriff, falsely accused and unjustly judged. And as for claiming her, I do so before God and man. My intention is to marry her and to protect her, as any husband would." His voice carried a quiet strength that brooked no argument. The townsfolk exchanged more bewildered glances. A preacher, marrying a woman they had just cast out as cursed? It defied everything they believed, everything they had done. Their rigid world had been shaken, and they were left standing in the dust, unsure of their footing, unsure of what to think or what to do next. Elijah's defiance had not sparked immediate anger, but rather a deep, unsettling confusion that left them speechless and without a clear path forward. Life with Elijah was a strange new world for Sarah. The first few days were a blur of quiet kindness from him and a deep, aching fear within her. Even though the chains were gone, the memory of their cold bite and the townsfolk's cruel stares lingered. She flinched at loud noises, avoided windows, and spoke in hushed tones, as if still afraid of drawing attention. Elijah, with gentle patience, understood. He didn't press her, but simply offered a steady, comforting presence. His home, the small parsonage next to the church, was modest but clean. The church itself, however, was in a sad state. It was old and weathered, with peeling paint, a leaky roof, and broken pews. It had been neglected for years, a reflection of the town's dwindling faith and the hard times that had settled over them. One afternoon, as Sarah sat by the window, watching Elijah try to patch a hole in the church roof with old scraps of wood, a small idea sparked within her. She had always been a worker, her hands skilled and strong. Perhaps, she thought, if she could fix something, mend something broken, it might help mend her own bruised spirit. Hesitantly, she approached Elijah. "Reverend," she began, her voice still a little shaky, "if you wouldn't mind, I could help with the church, the dust inside, the torn hymnals, the windows. I could try to fix some of it." Elijah's face lit up with a warm smile. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle, "that would be a blessing. This old building could certainly use a woman's touch." And so, Sarah found a new purpose. Each day she would go into the church. She started by sweeping away years of dust and cobwebs, her movements slow at first. Then growing more confident, she carefully mended torn pages of hymnals, stitched worn altar cloths, and scrubbed the grime from the windows until they sparkled, letting in more light than the church had seen in ages. She even began to repair the broken pews, her calloused fingers surprisingly adept with hammer and nail. It was hard work, but with each small repair, each clean surface, Sarah felt a tiny piece of her own brokenness begin to heal. The physical labor was a distraction from the cruel memories, and the act of creating beauty where there had been decay brought a quiet peace to her troubled heart. The church, slowly but surely, began to transform, and with it, so did Sarah. She still carried the scars of her humiliation, but now she also carried the quiet strength of renewed purpose. Even as Sarah found solace in the church, the town's distrust didn't simply vanish. Whispers still followed her, though now they were softer, mixed with confusion about Elijah's actions. Some townsfolk still believed she was cursed, while others resented Elijah for challenging their judgment. Elijah, however, stood as a rock against the lingering tide of suspicion. He defended Sarah not with anger, but with a quiet, firm resolve that was hard to argue against. When Mrs. Gable would make a snide remark about Sarah's presence at the market, Elijah would step forward, a gentle but unwavering smile on his face. "Mrs. Gable," he would say, his voice calm, "Sarah is a woman of good heart, working to make our church a brighter place. Perhaps you could offer her a kind word instead of judgment." His directness, free of malice, often left the gossips speechless, their barbs diffused. Threats, too, came in small, veiled ways. A rock thrown at the parsonage window late one night, a note slipped under the door, warning of God's wrath if the cursed woman remained. Each time, Elijah would find Sarah trembling, the old fear returning to her eyes. He would simply hold her close, his warmth a shield against the cold world outside. "They are afraid, Sarah," he would explain softly, stroking her hair. "Fear makes people do cruel things, but we will not let their fear win." He would address the congregation on Sundays, not by directly speaking of Sarah's past, but by preaching on forgiveness, on casting out judgment, and on the true meaning of Christian love. His sermons were powerful, reminding people of their own failings and the grace that was offered to all. Some scoffed, but others listened, their hearts slowly beginning to soften. One day, a group of young men, emboldened by drink, came to the parsonage, demanding Sarah leave. Elijah met them at the door, not with a shotgun, but with an open Bible in his hand. He spoke to them calmly, reminding them of their own mothers and sisters, of the mercy of Christ. He didn't back down, didn't show fear. His quiet courage, more than any threat, disarmed them, and they eventually slunk away, muttering. Through it all, Elijah was Sarah's unwavering protector, her anchor in a stormy sea. His constant support, his belief in her goodness, slowly helped her to push back against the shadows of humiliation, allowing the light of hope to truly take root. He was showing her, not just with words, but with every action, that she was worthy, loved, and safe. As weeks turned into months, the old church underwent a remarkable change. The cracked windows now shone, the pews were sturdy, and fresh paint covered the weathered wood, making the small building look cared for, almost new. This transformation was largely Sarah's doing, her quiet diligence a testament to her character. People couldn't help but notice. They saw her, day after day, working tirelessly, her hands busy, her brow furrowed in concentration. And with the church's revival, something else began to shift in the town. Sundays saw more families filling the newly repaired pews. They came to hear Elijah's sermons, which always spoke of love and understanding. But they also came to see the bright, clean church and the woman who had made it so. One blustery afternoon, young Timmy, a boy who had once thrown stones at Sarah, fell from a tree and broke his arm. His mother, distraught, rushed him to the parsonage, knowing Elijah had some skill with mending bones. As Elijah set the arm, Sarah, without a word, brought warm cloths, offered the boy a comforting drink, and spoke softly to calm his fears. Timmy's mother, who had been among the loudest accusers, watched Sarah with new eyes. Later, she brought Sarah a pie, a small offering of apology and gratitude. Small acts of kindness started to break down the walls of suspicion. When a fever swept through town, Sarah, remembering her own husband's illness, helped Elijah care for the sick. She sat by bedsides, brewed herbal teas, and offered gentle words, never asking for anything in return. Her compassion was undeniable. People saw that the cursed woman brought comfort, not harm. Elijah's unwavering faith in Sarah and his constant example of love also played a big part. He never wavered, never doubted. His calm certainty chipped away at the town's fear, making them question their own harsh judgments. The children, seeing their parents' softening attitudes and Sarah's gentle nature, slowly stopped shying away. Some even started to help her sweep the church, their small hands pushing brooms, their laughter filling the once empty halls. The tide was turning, slowly but surely, as Sarah's goodness shone through the shadows of the past. As the seasons changed, so too did the quiet life within the parsonage. Sarah and Elijah, bound by an extraordinary circumstance, found their connection deepening each day. Their love wasn't born of grand words or sudden passion, but from a shared journey through adversity and a profound, unspoken understanding. Sarah had never known such unwavering acceptance. Elijah saw past the cursed woman label, past her fears and her past hurts, to the strong, kind, capable woman beneath. He listened patiently when she spoke of her late husband, Thomas, or her childhood memories. He never judged, only offered a steady hand and a warm, comforting presence. Sarah, in turn, saw Elijah not just as her rescuer, but as a man of deep faith, quiet courage, and boundless compassion. She admired his strength in standing against the town's anger, and his gentle persistence in winning them over. They spent their evenings reading together by lamplight, often from the worn pages of his Bible, discussing the lessons within. Sarah, who had always found comfort in hard work, now found unexpected joy in these quiet moments of shared thought. Elijah would watch her, a soft smile on his face, as she meticulously mended a tear in his vest or baked a simple bread, her hands moving with grace and purpose. One evening, as the Kansas sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, They sat on the small porch of the parsonage. "Elijah," Sarah began, her voice soft, "why did you do it? Why did you stand up for me when everyone else?" Question mark. He turned to her, his kind eyes serious. "Because it was right, Sarah. Because I believe in the goodness of people, even when they lose their way in fear. And because I saw in you a spirit that deserved more than their judgment." He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing the faint scars left by the shackles. "I knew, even then, that you were a woman of strength and grace, and I knew that I wanted you by my side." Sarah's heart swelled with a feeling she hadn't known since Thomas's passing, a deep, comforting love, free from the shadow of sorrow. She squeezed his hand. "And I, Elijah, am grateful for the life you have given me. You have shown me kindness when I knew only cruelty, and hope when I had none." Their love was a quiet, steady flame, forged in the crucible of public shame and strengthened by shared purpose. It was a love built on respect, on faith, and on the courage to defy a world that had tried to break them both. It was a love that promised a future, not just survival. Months later, the town square once again saw a gathering, but this time there were no shackles, no jeers, and no accusations. Instead, a small archway of wildflowers stood near the old well, and the air was filled not with dread, but with a quiet, hopeful buzz. Sarah, wearing a simple dress Elijah's sister had sent, stood beside him. Her face, once etched with fear, now held a serene beauty. Her eyes, still carrying a hint of past sorrow, also shone with a newfound joy. Elijah, dressed in his Sunday best, looked at her with a love that was plain for all to see. He had asked her, simply and earnestly, to marry him properly, to make their union official before God and their community. Sarah had agreed, choosing the very spot of her deepest shame as the place for her greatest triumph. Sheriff Brody stood nearby, his face less stern, a respectful nod for Elijah. Mrs. Gable, though still a little stiff, had brought a small bouquet of prairie flowers for Sarah. Even some of the children who had thrown stones now stood quietly, their eyes curious and a little shy. Elijah began the simple ceremony himself, his voice calm and clear. He spoke of love, of forgiveness, and of the power of faith to heal brokenness. He spoke of two souls finding each other in the midst of a storm and building a sanctuary together. When it came time for vows, Sarah looked into Elijah's eyes, remembering the cold metal of the chains, the harsh words, and the moment he had stepped forward, a beacon in her darkest hour. "I, Sarah, take you, Elijah," she said, her voice steady and true, "to be my husband, to love you, to honor you, and to stand by you, always." Elijah, in turn, squeezed her hand. "I, Elijah, take you, Sarah, to be my wife, to cherish you, to protect you, and to walk with you in faith all the days of my life." As they exchanged rings, simple silver bands, a quiet cheer rippled through the small crowd. It wasn't a loud, boisterous celebration, but a heartfelt acknowledgement. It was a testament to a love that had defied judgment, a redemption found in the most unexpected of places. In the very square where she had been cast out, Sarah was now welcomed, not just as Elijah's wife, but as a valued member of the community, her past humiliation transformed into a profound and enduring victory. They kissed, a soft, tender touch, sealing their promise under the vast Kansas sky, a new chapter beginning where the old, painful one had ended.